This is AMSCO Chapter 28, Promise and Turmoil. So this is going to be focusing on the 1960s through early 1970s when it comes to foreign policy. So we're going to be looking at the presidencies of John F. Kennedy Jr., we're going to be looking at the presidencies of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and to some extent Richard Nixon. We are going to focus on Richard Nixon in the 70s in Chapter 29, but this is going to talk about a little bit about the Vietnam War and the foreign policy of the Nixon era as well. So let's get started right away. So in the election of 1960, we're going to see John F. Kennedy Jr. running as a liberal Democrat with a lot of focuses on expanding the liberal state and expanding liberalism compared to what it was in the 1950s with the Eisenhower and conservatism that was going on in that decade. In this election, it's extremely close popular vote wise, one of the closest of all time. Again, there's only a couple elections that would be similar to this closeness-wise. One was the election of Ruther B. Hayes, which was a slightly closer vote. But if you look at this map, you see Kennedy wins the traditional, the deep South states, but he also wins some of these northeast states as well. And again, the popular vote was extremely close, separated only by about 120,000 votes. In this election, they're going to be using one of the very first times a presidential debate between both Nixon and Kennedy. Kennedy came off on this presidential debate way more cooler. He portrayed himself much more confidently, and Nixon sort of was seen not really coming off very confident, and came off like he was very nervous, he was sweaty, and a lot of people think that is what gave Kennedy just the slightest of margins to win this election. So Kennedy, during the foreign affairs, a couple Cold War things that happened was one during the early parts of his era. The Berlin Wall was raised up by East Germany. And the real reason why, it was not to keep people out of East Germany, it was keeping East Germans out of West Berlin. There were so many East Germans that were basically immigrating to gain the access to West Berlin and the freedoms of West Berlin, and eventually, then migrating to other parts of the world, that the Soviets and the East Berliners walled up the city of West Berlin, and basically putting a wall around West Berlin. JFK went to West Berlin and made this really famous speech. Here's what he said: "Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. As free a man, I take pride in the words Ich in Berliner," which means I am a Berliner. It's a famous Berlin speech. Eventually, the Berlin Wall will be torn down with the fall of the Soviet communism in the late 1980s, early 1990s. The second big Cold War issue was that he basically had to deal with the Cuban and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Cubans allowed the Soviets to start installing nuclear weapons into their island. We found that out by looking at spy satellites. And we basically found that the Soviets were putting up these military installations there. And we knew that the closeness of Cuba to America basically allowed the Soviets to have access to hitting almost every single American city with these new missiles. So Kennedy was going to be very sort of hard on, and a very hard stance on this. JFK will order a naval blockade and demand the missiles be removed. Very tense situations. The ships coming into Cuba with this naval blockade keep coming. Eventually, they'll turn around the very last minute. An agreement will be made eventually with the Soviets and the Americans to remove the missiles from Cuba, with the agreement that the missiles that the U.S. has will be removed from Turkey as well. And there's again some more of the satellite pictures that allowed us to know that there's missiles there. And you see Kennedy and Khrushchev really both sort of doing this arm wrestling match, both of them with the hydrogen bomb, nuclear weapons, both in their back pocket. Kennedy will move forward with a Cold War strategy called the flexible response. This is basically him moving away from more traditional nuclear weaponries to traditional conventional arms. So less reliance on massive retaliation and nuclear weaponry to basically push foreign policy, and then moving towards spending money on conventional arms and inserting Green Berets and insurgents in parts of the world to sort of sway the democracy and elections and foreign policy and militaries in an American way. In regards to Kennedy's domestic plan, he doesn't really have much time to enact it. He's assassinated pretty much a year and a half after his election or his inauguration. And his new frontier, which was this wide sweeping plan to sort of reinvigorate and reunite the New Deal, never really takes place. The Congress is dominated by Republicans during his first year and a half, and Kennedy is not really able to pass much before his assassination. He will be killed by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. A lot of conspiracy theories about that. Was Oswald working alone? Was he working with the Russians or the Cubans? Was this the inside job? There will be a Supreme Court and congressional oversight to look into this. What they find out is that Lee Harvey Oswald basically was a lone shooter working with no other hired or connected person. And here's the video of his death.
Using a Bell & Howell 8mm camera with a telephoto lens, Abraham Zapruder captured one of the most shocking moments in history.
And he'll be shot twice. So will the governor of Texas as well. And then he rushed to the hospital. Basically, Lyndon Johnson will get sworn into the presidency on Air Force One, and immediately, well, not immediately, but he initially will start pushing his domestic plan. It's basically an extension of JFK's domestic plan. So the new frontier is going to be morphed into the Great Society under Johnson. What allows Johnson to move forward with this Great Society is that in the midterm elections, Congress will be then taken over by the Democrats. So it allows Johnson to have both the White House and Congress on his side, allowing him to enact this wide sweeping domestic plan for poverty and economics, and there's a wide sweeping reform system called the Great Society. Here's some of the key parts of the Great Society. One was a war on poverty. Probably one of the most important parts of this Great Society was basically to reduce urban poverty. One was the Office of Economic Opportunity to help basically train and give impoverished individuals, especially minorities, more job opportunities. The Housing of Urban Development will basically create projects that are going to allow for low-income housing in urban areas. In 1965, he's going to pass the Immigration Act, which will eliminate the whole quota system that basically started in the 1920s to limit immigration. He's going to end that, so it's going to expand immigration, especially among Mexican Americans, Latin Americans, and Asian Americans. He's going to have a huge benefit of creating both Medicare and Medicaid, which is healthcare for seniors and healthcare for the poor and disabled. He's going to start the education with the Higher Education Act and the Project Head Start to basically fund low-income schools and preschools for impoverished kids. Huge consumer protection with the Water and Clean Air Acts, Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, and also the Highway Safety Act. A lot of these were spurred by muckrakers. One was Ralph Nader, who wrote about the unregulation of the car industry, and one was by Rachel Carson, who was writing about DDT and the pesticides of the farming industry. The problem with the Great Society is that one, what was going on foreign policy-wise in this time period was the Vietnam War, and so much of our funding was being focused towards the Vietnam War that the Great Society was underfunded. That was a big part of it. The second big problem is that by the time the late 60s rolled around, a lot of Americans started to shift their ideals away from liberalism, and with the election of Nixon in 1968, we're going to see a shift of domestic ideas that sort of limits the Great Society's impact on America. Another big part of the late 50s and early 60s is the change of the Supreme Court, and the Warren Court is going to pass some probably the most expansive cases outside John Marshall coming from Earl Warren and the Warren Court. So extreme landmark cases that do come up on the AP test quite a bit. So you are going to need to know about these. Also next year in government classes, these are some of the key court cases you'll be looking at, breaking down and stuff like that. Okay, regarding civil rights, a couple of the big ones is Brown versus Board of Education that desegregates public schools. Loving versus Virginia in 1967 that allows interracial marriage. And probably it's one that is a little more difficult to understand, but very important, is Baker versus Carr. And what that's going to do, that's going to redraw electoral districts to make sure that the electoral districts that were really focused and supported and probably favored rural areas of America are going to be redrawn. It's called one person, one vote. So we're going to redraw them so that every single person has the same impact congressionally in America. So every electoral district basically has the same amount of people in that electoral district, therefore has the same political power. So that's really important. In regards to rights to criminal, this is probably the most sweeping cases there. There's actually four of them. One I forgot to put down here. Here are the four. Mapp versus Ohio. Basically, unlawfully seized evidence is not allowed in trial. Gideon versus Wainwright. Suspects are entitled to an attorney if they can afford one. We have Miranda versus Arizona, where police must tell suspects their rights during an arrest. And you also have Escobedo versus Illinois, where basically you have the right to a lawyer. So you have those four really important Supreme Court cases that basically redefine those 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th Amendments. They give rights to the accused and the due process laws. Also, there was a lot of court cases that dealt with freedom of expression and privacy. For example, Yates versus the United States basically stated that the First Amendment protects a radical and revolutionary speech. That's like flag burning and stuff like that. It really was focused on communism speech to the 1950s. Engel versus Vitale stated that public schools cannot require students to say prayers within those public schools, that those prayers violate kids' First Amendment rights. And Griswold versus Connecticut was due to privacy. Connecticut had outlawed or prohibited the use of contraceptives. Well, the thought was how would the state know that you're using contraceptives? And there was the citizen's right to privacy, which did allow them to use contraceptives. Okay, civil rights during the 1950s and 60s. It really starts off in 1954. And the whole thought was that can two schools, exactly the same facilities and same quality of education, be segregated? And if they're segregated, can the people who are in these schools be equal? The thought is no. And we know that the reality that there really was not fairness. There was not, separate but equal facilities. You see here the pupil expenditure. You see how little money was spent on African American students compared to white students during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s in southern states. And in reality, you see a black school compared to a white school, the spending is drastically different. So in Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, we see Linda Brown suing the state regarding that she was not allowed to attend the white school, even though that was closer to her house. And in the Supreme Court decision, we're going to see Earl Warren making the opinion that basically Linda Brown wins this case. So it overturns Jim Crow laws in educational facilities. Separate but equal as doctrines overturned, which is going to allow then for other aspects of this Jim Crow laws to eventually be tested within the court of law. There's going to be a lot of resistance to Brown, obviously. Where most Southern senators are going to be opposed to this. The Southern Manifesto was signed in 1956 by most Southern congressmen that were basically arguing against Brown. One Texas congressman who was actually someone who was not going to sign this was eventually going to be the president, Lyndon B. Johnson, back when he was just a House Representative, congressman. And of course, the KKK, the White Citizen Councils, were also going to get behind trying to push back against this Brown decision. Okay, one area where this was actually going to be tested and looked into was going to be Little Rock, Arkansas. In Little Rock, we're going to see Governor Orville Faubus is going to be opposing this plan of reopening Arkansas's main high school to a group of students that were African American. And Eisenhower will send in the 101st Airborne to protect the Little Rock 9 African American students that were chosen to enter the school. And we're going to see basically school desegregation slowly get better and better and better. Again, it's going to be a long time coming. In the 1970s, we're going to see that eventually school districts are going to do forced busing to sort of force open segregated schools in urban areas. We'll talk about that later on in the 70s. Okay, 1955, we're going to see the Montgomery bus boycott being the really first major protest in this new civil rights era. Rosa Parks is going to refuse to get up and move to the back of the bus, basically civil disobedience. And she's going to get arrested, and it's going to start basically a year-long boycott. It's going to be headed by Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which sort of shows you that a big part of the civil rights movement is going to be the use of churches and religion to sort of back up some of the nonviolent aspects of these protests. And the boycott will be successful. The Supreme Court will rule that bus segregation was unconstitutional in 1956. And in 1957, President Eisenhower is going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This will be the major first federal legislation for civil rights since Reconstruction. And it gives the Justice Department the right to stop states from interfering with African Americans' right to vote. Problem with this is that it's going to not be very widely enforced in this time period. It's going to basically be very, so I would compare this to the Sherman Act in the Gilded Age, because it was a good law, but it really had no tooth to it. The enforcement body of this really didn't enforce this at all. Another group that's going to form is called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They're going to form in 1960 to stage sit-ins on lunch counters. So these sit-ins on lunch counters were going to focus on desegregating these all-white lunch facilities. They're going to be nonviolent. They're going to come in, sit down. They're going to demand to be served. They are not going to be served. And eventually they're going to be arrested for basically violating these Jim Crow laws. And the whole thing is that they'll be put in jail, and then a new wave of students are going to come in and sit down, get arrested, and then go into the jail. A new wave of students will come in. And the whole process is going to be clogging up the court system and the jail houses. And of course, there's going to be a lot of violence, a lot of heckling, a lot of abuse of these protesters as well. The sins will spread throughout the South, and also there's going to be protests throughout the North as well. And even though no law was passed, many of these lunch counters and these big chain stores will desegregate their stores to combat these protests and these boycotts. Okay, in 1961, a group of core members, Congress of Racial Equality, is going to test the new laws that allow that basically all buses and all bus terminals and all bus all bus stations must be desegregated. So they're going to be traveling from Washington, D.C. down to Jackson, Mississippi, traveling through the most racist and the hardest parts of the South, segregation-wise. And on this trip, we're going to see whites and blacks mixing together, getting off the bus, going into the facilities together, testing to make sure that African Americans would be allowed to use the facilities equally to white. A lot of violence is going to take place in Anniston, Alabama. One of the buses was going to be bombed. In Birmingham, a gang of whites will come in and basically attack the bus riders. And in Mississippi, the riders were threatened, but what happened? The governor stepped in and arrested the riders at the request of JFK to avoid any more violence. There's a bus being bombed. And what JFK is going to do, he's going to order the ICC to crack down on interstate bus segregation. So we finally see the government step up and actually enforce some of these laws to make sure that bus segregation is fully ended. You're also going to see the crisis in Birmingham. Stuff was started to slow down in regards to the civil rights era. So Martin Luther King Jr. planned this march and boycott and protest on the Birmingham streets to almost incite some type of violent reaction against them. The thought was, we need to have a crisis to bargain with, was his thought. So he's going to launch a demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, and he knew this would provoke a violent response. And when the protest started, he will be arrested and go to jail. In that jail, he'll write his famous Letters from a Birmingham Jail, which states about why we cannot wait, and why, and it sort of details the horrors of segregation, the horrors of life of living as a black person, and why African Americans can't wait any longer, and they must start pushing to end these civil rights abuses. Eventually he'll be released, and the movement will start back up. When the protesters go downtown, the police, Bull Connor, will basically bring out attack dogs, will get the fire, I can't think of the word, the fire station and the firemen to come out and spray the children and the young people with hoses. And eventually the whole world sees that these children and these young people are being abused by the police and the people of Birmingham. It's going to really sort of turn the tide on the civil rights to be allow for more changes to actually happen. So a couple months later, they have the March of Washington, D.C., where over 100,000 people, about 200,000 people, will demonstrate a march to Washington, D.C. This is where the Martin Luther King Jr. will have this famous I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial. In 1964, we're going to see a whole bunch of young college students going down to Mississippi to try to register Mississippians to vote. And in this, we're going to see 3 college students get murdered down there: James Chaney, Michael Schwimmer, and Andrew Goodman. Their bodies will be found, and eventually we're going to see how this registering to vote is going to get the government to step up and actually make some real laws to get to vote. Before that, though, Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Shuttleworth, Ralph Abernathy is going to stage a march from the Capitol, or Selma, Alabama, to the capital, Montgomery. They use Selma because we see the majority of the citizens there are black, but only 3% of them were registered to vote. We're going to see huge amounts of marchers marching. And when they reach the Edmund Pettus Bridge, we're going to see the police stop them violently. We're going to see the police beat marchers with over 70 African Americans hospitalized. This took place on Sunday, so it's going to be called Bloody Sunday. And because of this, we're going to see the federal government start acting and starting passing legislation to give African Americans solidify civil rights for them. The Civil Rights Act of '64 is going to give the government the power to prevent racial discrimination and make Jim Crow laws illegal. It's also going to create the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to basically push for African American jobs and being hired economically. A year later, they'll pass the Voting Rights Act of '65, which will outlaw the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, and other things like this. And this will spur in the 24th Amendment, which will officially be that amendment that ends any discriminatory tactics to limit black suffrage. Okay. So de facto versus de jure segregation. De facto desegregation is segregation by chance or by just habit, where de jure segregation is segregation by law. In the North, there wasn't really true segregation laws, but there was massive problems because so many blacks lived in the urban neighborhoods and so many whites had moved to the suburbs. And so even though there wasn't actual segregation in the North, blacks were living in segregated areas and going to segregated schools and had less opportunities because of just the action of so many whites moving to the suburbs during the 1950s. And that's going to spur a huge sort of wave of race riots around the North. It was based on these impoverished conditions and bad urban neighborhoods and police brutality. So the two biggest, most probably famous of the riots were the Watts riots in 1965 and the Detroit riots in 1967, both sort of spurred by police brutality. And the problem was that, again, not really much has been done to help Northern African Americans out during this time period. Also, by the mid-'60s, we're going to see a wave and a rise of the Black Power movement. A movement basically where it's stressing black unity and distinctiveness over assimilation. We're also going to see the SNCC group sort of turn from a group in the civil rights era that was wanting to work with whites to a group that was only looking to work with black people. Part of this was the rise of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X was an African-American man from Kansas. After his stint in the penitentiary, he founds Islam, and he starts with the black Muslims, really pushing a black power agenda, where basically they don't want whites' help. They're wanting to use violence when attacked. So basically, if you're it's rather than non-violence, being willing to defend yourself during attacks and stuff like that. Eventually, he'll start breaking away from that ideology, and eventually, the Nation of Islam will criticize him and basically have him killed in 1965. And the Black Panther movement of 1960s also was a sort of vigilante group that was looking to make sure that African Americans in the urban areas were not being targeted by police, and police brutality was a sort of checking into that as well. So it urged blacks to arm themselves and confront white society rather than just sort of lay back and hope things change on their own. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. will be assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, and this will cause over 100 riots nationwide. And he'll be murdered by James Earl Ray. Okay, we are going to talk about the Vietnam War in class on Tuesday, so that's our lecture for the day, and you guys have a great one. Bye all.